Grant Holloway saw her through the glass of a baby supply store on the corner of Broughton Street, Savannah. He was walking with Monica Langford, his fiancée, daughter of the Holloway family's most important financial partner, on their way to meet the wedding planner. 3 weeks until the ceremony. She stood at the checkout counter, her back to the street. 4 or 5 small items on the counter. A newborn onesie, diapers, a baby bottle. She picked one up, checked the price, put it back. Picked up another, checked the price, put it back. In the end, she kept only the 2 cheapest things. She turned toward the register. Grant stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Gray-blue eyes, slightly prominent forehead, hairline tilting a touch to the left. He knew that face. He had seen it in his dreams 3 times over the past 5 months, 3 times arriving somewhere only to find she was already gone. But she was here, 4 meters away, separated by a pane of glass, alive, breathing, and carrying a 7-month belly he never knew existed. Jolene Tabb, the woman whose death certificate had been placed on his desk 5 months ago. 3 seconds. She spotted him through the glass. No flinch, no color draining from her face, no look of a person in hiding who had just been found. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, the gaze of someone who had known this moment would come, just not that it would be today, then turned back, paid, took her bag, and walked out through the store's rear exit. Grant? Monica touched his elbow. What's wrong? You've gone white. Grant didn't answer. His right hand was turning the plain silver ring on his ring finger, an unconscious habit, whenever something too large passed through his chest before he could name it. Head back first. I have something to take care of. He said it in his normal voice, the voice his people heard every day when he gave an order that required no explanation. Monica looked at him 1 second longer. She didn't ask. 3 months beside Grant Holloway had taught her one thing when he said less than usual. It meant things were bigger than usual. She turned and walked toward the car parked at the end of the street. Before opening the door, she glanced back once. Grant was still standing there, in front of the glass, staring into the now empty store. But what he didn't know then, what he would only learn in the days ahead, was that the woman in the baby store was not the only surprise. She was just the first. And the list of people who had known she was alive, who had kept silent, who had signed a forged death certificate, who had taken money to bury a name, that list would grow longer than anything he had ever imagined. If this story touched you, hit that like button to support us. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next one. Every story carries a lesson that life doesn't always tell us directly. Grant didn't go home right away. He stood in front of the shop window for a few more seconds after Monica had gotten into the car and left. Then he turned on his heel and walked quickly toward the parking lot 2 blocks away. He drove through downtown Savannah, with no music on, without calling anyone, just driving. 20 minutes later, he stopped in front of a warehouse building in the industrial district, south of the city. From the outside, it looked like every other warehouse along that road. Inside was the operating office of the Holloway organization, the place where the real decisions were made, the place even Monica had never set foot in. Grant entered his private office, closed the door, and sat down. He took out his phone and called Trent, one of the fastest information handlers in the system. The call lasted less than 40 seconds. Grant said, Mercy Memorial Hospital, admission and death records from the past 12 months, name, Jolene Tabb. I need results before 12 o'clock tonight. Trent didn't ask why. No one who worked for Grant Holloway asked why. He put the phone down. The room went silent. He sat there for a while, both hands resting on the desk, staring into the empty space in front of him. Then he opened the second drawer on the right, the locked drawer, the one he hadn't opened in months. Inside, there was only one thing, a small piece of dark gray fabric, still clinging to a single white thread. The last time Jolene had sewn the button back onto his suit jacket, before that piece of paper was placed on the table and everything stopped. Grant picked up the scrap of fabric. He didn't smell it. He didn't cradle it tenderly. He held it, then put it back and locked the drawer. That was all. He pushed his chair back, stood, poured himself a glass of water, drank it all, then set the glass in the sink. Then he sat down again and waited. At 11:43 that night, his phone vibrated. Trent sent the results through an encrypted message. Grant opened it and read it twice, the first time quickly, the second time slowly. Then he placed the phone face down on the desk. Mercy Memorial Hospital had no patient named Jolene Tabb anywhere in its admission system for that entire year. The record hadn't been erased. The name hadn't been misspelled. It had never existed. She had never been admitted there. She had never been declared dead there. The death notice Desmond had given him 5 months earlier clearly listed the hospital name, the room number, the time of death, and the signature of the doctor on duty. All of it was fabricated. A death written on paper by people who had never witnessed it. 5 months earlier, when Grant read that paper, he had only read as far as the line that said deceased, and then he stopped. He didn't read any further. He didn't check. He didn't call the hospital. He didn't ask anyone. He believed it, because the person who handed him that paper was Desmond, his uncle. The only person he never thought would lie to him. Grant sat motionless for a very long time in the windowless room. The fingers of his right hand turned the silver ring, slowly, steadily, one circle after another. He wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger needed to know who it was angry at, and right now, that list wasn't complete. He picked up the phone again. This time, he made 2 calls. The first was to Dr. Warren Keene, the Holloway family's private physician for more than 20 years, the man whose signature appeared on the death notice. The second was to Father Edmund Shaw, the parish priest of the church the Holloway family had contributed to every year for generations. Both calls were short, both polite, both carrying the same message. Tomorrow evening, I would like to invite you both to dinner. There are a few family matters I want to discuss. His voice was normal, gentle, as if he were truly inviting them to dinner. Both accepted at once. Grant put the phone down, turned off the light, sat in the dark for a few more minutes. He thought about the gray-blue eyes behind the glass that afternoon. She hadn't been afraid when she saw him. She had prepared herself for that moment. That meant she had known, from the first day she was pushed into the dark, that sooner or later, the darkness wouldn't be able to hold her forever. But she had still stayed in it for 5 months, alone, without calling him, without looking for him, without asking for help. And that question, the question of why she hadn't come to him, lay still at the bottom of Grant's chest, heavier than any forged piece of paper. He stood up and drove back to the mansion through the night. Tomorrow would begin with a dinner, and that dinner wouldn't end with dessert. Dinner was set for 6 o'clock the next evening, at the restaurant where the Holloway family kept a private room on the 2nd floor. A room with no nameplate, not listed for reservations, and only those who had been invited knew how to get upstairs. Grant arrived 15 minutes early. He sat at the head of the table, ordered a bottle of wine, 3 glasses, and told the server not to come back in until he called. The room was quiet. The light was pale yellow. The curtains were drawn shut. Dr. Warren Keene arrived on time. He stepped inside, shook Grant's hand, and sat down in the chair on the right. His forehead was beaded with sweat, even though the room was cool, and he had just come up from an air-conditioned parking area. Grant poured wine for him and pushed the glass across. Keene took the glass, thanked him, and took a sip. His hand held the glass normally, but his forehead was still wet. Father Edmund Shaw arrived 5 minutes late. He knocked lightly before entering, nodded to Grant, nodded to Keene, and sat in the chair on the left. His round, silver-rimmed glasses slipped slightly down the bridge of his nose as he lowered his head to sit. He pushed them back up, accepted the glass of wine Grant had already poured, and said thank you. Grant didn't rush. He asked Keene about the clinic, asked Shaw about the church, asked whether the weather this week was too hot. The 2 men answered politely. Keene spoke more than Shaw. Shaw answered briefly, his voice soft, his eyes occasionally dropping to the wineglass he almost didn't drink from. The first 15 minutes of dinner passed like every other social dinner the 2 men had ever attended in that room. Then Grant set his wineglass down. Not hard, not softly, just set it down and didn't pick it up again, he said, in an ordinary voice, as though he were simply continuing the small talk. Lately, I've been reviewing all of the family's legal records from the past 2 years. Contracts, medical papers, certificates, everything with a signature connected to the Holloway household. Every document the 2 of you have signed for my family. Every paper. When he finished speaking, he went silent. He didn't ask a question. He didn't look at either man first. He looked into his own wineglass as if he were thinking about something else. The room fell into silence, the kind of silence that an outsider would see as normal, only a pause between 2 conversations. But Grant wasn't an outsider. Keene set his wineglass down on the table, a little too hard. The wine rippled lightly in the glass, touched the sides, trembled, then settled. Keene didn't realize what he had just done. His hand drew back and rested on his lap beneath the table, where he thought Grant couldn't see it. Shaw lifted his right hand to adjust his glasses. He pushed them up the bridge of his nose, though they hadn't slipped at all. His finger touched the silver frame, then lowered again. A small gesture, quick and unconscious, like someone scratching his nose when it doesn't itch. And then it happened. Half a second. Keen's eyes turned left, and Shaw's eyes turned right. Their gazes met across the middle of the table. It wasn't the look of two acquaintances sharing dinner. It was the look of two men standing together on a thin plank who had just heard it crack. Half a second. Then both of them turned back to Grant, their faces normal, as though nothing had happened. But Grant had seen it. He had been taught to read people when he was 17. Desmond had taught him that a good liar could control his mouth, control his hands, control his voice, but no one could control the eyes in the first half second. That half second was real. Everything after it was performance. The two men sitting in front of Grant tonight had shared a secret, and when that secret was threatened, their first instinct wasn't to look at Grant. It was to look at each other, because they needed to know whether the other one could hold. That was the reflex of accomplices, not the reflex of innocent men. Grant didn't ask another question. He smiled faintly and said, "I'm sure it's only paperwork, nothing complicated. I just want to organize things properly." Then he called for the server to bring in the main course. The rest of dinner passed in pale, empty conversation. Keen ate faster than usual. Shaw barely ate at all. At 9:15 that evening, the two men excused themselves. Grant shook both their hands at the door of the room, thanked them politely, and said he would see them again. Keen walked out first, his back slightly stiff. Shaw followed after him, adjusting his glasses one more time before going down the stairs. Grant returned to the table, sat down, looked at the two wine glasses across from him. Keen's glass was nearly empty. Shaw's was almost untouched. He didn't need them to confess. He didn't need proof from their mouths. He only needed to know whether they belonged on the list. And tonight, in that half second, both of them had written their own names onto it. The list now had 3 people: Desmond, Keen, Shaw, and Grant knew it didn't end there, because a false death required more than a doctor and a priest. It required someone to stay silent long enough, someone who knew the address everyone else didn't know, someone who delivered supplies every 2 weeks to a girl who, on paper, no longer existed. And that person was sleeping in a room on the first floor of this mansion, less than 20 steps away from Grant. While Grant sat alone in the restaurant's VIP room, counting the name of each accomplice, more than 15 kilometers away, on the western edge of suburban Savannah, Jolene Tabb was pushing open the door of a small 1-story house with a faded blue-painted door. She set the bag of things on the kitchen table. Grandma Birdie sat in the wooden chair beside the stove, her hands resting on her lap, looking at the bag. Inside the bag were only 2 items, the 2 cheapest items Jolene had kept from the shop that afternoon. The old woman looked at them, then looked up at her granddaughter's face, and didn't ask. Grandma Birdie was 78 years old, and she had lived long enough to know when not to ask. Jolene didn't sit down to rest. She washed her hands, dried them, then sat in front of the old sewing machine set in the corner of the kitchen. It was a foot-powered Singer, its black paint almost completely chipped away, its pedal creaking every time she pressed it. It was the most valuable thing in this house, and also the only thing that kept the 2 of them alive from month to month. Jolene took in clothing repairs for the neighbors around the area, stitching seams back together, replacing zippers, taking in waists, letting down hems. The money wasn't much, but it was steady. Tonight, she wasn't repairing a customer's clothes. She took a leftover piece of fabric from last week's order, a soft ivory white cotton, spread it across the table, and cut it along a small curve. She was making a newborn shirt from leftover fabric, because new fabric was something she couldn't afford. The sound of the sewing machine ran evenly through the kitchen. Grandma Birdie sat still and listened for a while. Then she asked, her voice soft, as if she were asking about the weather, "Did you see anyone out there?" Jolene stopped the machine. 1 second. The pedal stopped creaking. Then she pressed it again, her eyes lowered to the line of fabric. "No, Grandma." Grandma Birdie nodded. "All right." Those 2 words, "all right," she said in the voice of someone who knew her granddaughter was lying, but chose not to peel the lie open. And Jolene knew her grandmother knew, but neither of them said anything more. In this house, silence wasn't coldness. Silence was the way the two of them protected each other from things that speaking aloud wouldn't change. The next day, Jolene delivered the repaired clothes to a neighbor woman at the end of the road. The woman took the bag of clothes, checked through them, nodded with satisfaction, then handed over the money. A few small bills. Jolene took them, folded them neatly, and put them into her shirt pocket. The neighbor looked at Jolene's rounded belly, stayed quiet for a moment, then asked, "Where's the baby's father, child?" Jolene looked straight into the woman's eyes. "There isn't one." The neighbor fell silent, not because she believed it, but because she understood that the answer was a closed door, and she hadn't been invited to step through it. Jolene said thank you, turned around, and walked home. On the way back, she passed a thrift shop. She had walked past that shop many times, but today she stopped. In the display window was a wooden cradle, a used one, its white paint yellowed slightly, its legs a little curved, but still sturdy. Jolene stood looking at the cradle through the glass. She looked at it for a long time. Her eyes moved from the side rail down to the legs, from the legs up to the small price tag stuck in the corner. She calculated. The money she had just received for repairing the neighbor's clothes, plus the money left in the tin box at home, minus Grandma Birdie's medicine for this month, minus electricity, minus rice. She finished calculating. Then she walked away. It wasn't enough. That night, Grandma Birdie went to bed early. Jolene sat alone at the kitchen table, opening the small, hard-covered notebook where she recorded daily income and expenses. She turned through page after page. Income. Money for repairing the clothes of the neighbor at the end of the road. Money for mending a shirt for the old man at the three-way intersection. Money for replacing a zipper for the woman who ran the grocery shop. Expenses. Arthritis medicine for Grandma Birdie, rice, cooking oil, electricity, water, soap, and one line she had written separately at the bottom of the page, underlined, "Things for the baby." There was no number beside that line yet, because there was no money to write down. Jolene closed the notebook, set the pen down, turned off the desk lamp. The kitchen went dark. Only a little streetlight still fell through the small window. Jolene sat in the darkness, both hands resting on her belly. She felt the baby moving inside her, slow and light, like a child turning over in sleep. She whispered, just loud enough for herself and the baby to hear, "Mommy will manage. Mommy has never failed to manage." Her voice was calm, but in the darkness, no one saw her hand gripping the edge of the table, and no one knew how many times she had said that sentence to the child in her womb to remind herself that she could still stay on her feet. And on the other side of the city, inside the Holloway mansion, Grant Holloway was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about an incomplete list. He didn't know that 15 kilometers away from him, the woman he was searching for was sitting in the dark, sewing clothes for their child out of leftover fabric, counting money coin by coin, and not waiting for him to come. The next morning, Grant sat in the study at the mansion, the door closed. He had 3 names on the list: Desmond, Keene, Shaw, but those 3 names only told him who had lied. They didn't tell him where Jolene was. He had tried every method in his system. He had people trace registered residential addresses, check rental records, scan electricity and water accounts across the counties surrounding Savannah. Nothing. Not a single trace bearing the name Jolene Tabb existed anywhere within a radius of 100 miles. Desmond had erased everything. Erased it as if she had truly died. Grant sat still for a while. Then he picked up the internal phone and called one name only. "Tell Perry to come up to my office." Perry Sims walked in 3 minutes later. He stood in front of Grant's desk, both hands hanging at his sides, his face expressionless. It was the face Grant had seen every day for years. The face of a man who had trained his whole life not to reveal anything, no matter what he was thinking, no matter what he feared, no matter what he was hiding. Perry was the Holloway family's driver, the man who stood outside the door of every meeting, the man who knew everything and was never asked for his opinion. And Grant knew, from the way his list had formed over the past 2 days, that Perry knew more than all of them. Grant looked straight into Perry's eyes, no circling around it. "Perry, I know she's alive. I need the address." Perry didn't flinch, didn't swallow, didn't look away. He stood still. His face stayed exactly the same. But one thing changed, so small that only someone looking very closely would have seen it. His shoulders, those 2 shoulders that were always straight, always stiff, dropped by 1 centimeter, as if a cord that had been pulled tight for too long had just been touched by someone's hand. and it hadn't snapped, but it trembled. 10 seconds passed. 20 seconds. 30 seconds. The room was so quiet Grant could hear the clock on the wall. Perry didn't speak. Grant didn't say anything more. He had asked. He wouldn't ask twice. That was the rule between them. A rule neither man ever said aloud, but both understood. Grant asked once, and Perry either answered or didn't, never forced. Then Perry bent down. He picked up the pen on Grant's desk, tore a piece of paper from the small notebook beside the phone, and wrote, one line, one address. His handwriting was even, clear, and steady. He placed the piece of paper on the surface of the desk, set the pen down beside it, then straightened again. He looked at Grant for 1 second, then he turned, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind him. From beginning to end, Perry didn't say a single word. Grant looked at the piece of paper on the desk, an address on the western edge of suburban Savannah. He picked it up, read it, folded it, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he sat there a little longer, thinking about the man who had just walked out of the room. Perry had known Jolene was alive for the past 5 months. He was the one who delivered supplies to her every 2 weeks under Desmond's orders, the only person who knew the address, the final link between Jolene and the Holloway family. He had kept silent because Desmond had erased his younger sister's large debt in exchange for that silence. Perry hadn't stayed quiet out of loyalty. Perry had stayed quiet because he was trapped, and today, with a piece of paper placed on the desk, he chose not to be trapped anymore. Grant understood the price Perry had just paid. He didn't say thank you, because Perry didn't need to hear it, and because between the two of them, thank you was too light a phrase for things this heavy. He stood, took his coat, and walked outside. Perry was already sitting behind the wheel, the engine running, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't ask Grant where they were going. He didn't need to ask. He had written that address. Grant opened the car door, sat in the back seat, and said, "Go." Perry drove through the gates of the mansion, turned left, and headed west. Neither of them said another word during the 20 minutes on the road, because everything that needed to be said was already on that piece of paper, and everything that couldn't be said had been understood by both of them for a long time. Perry stopped the car some distance from the house. Grant looked through the car window and saw exactly what he had imagined from the moment he read the address on that piece of paper. A small, single-story house with a tin roof and a faded blue-painted door, sitting at the end of a dirt road on the western edge of suburban Savannah, the kind of place people came to when they didn't want to be found. Grant opened the car door and said to Perry, "Wait here." Perry nodded and turned off the engine. Grant walked to the front door. The door wasn't locked. He knocked twice. No one came to open it, but from inside came the sound of a pot touching the stove. He pushed the door open and stepped in. Grandma Bertie Tabb was standing at the stove, her back turned toward the door. She didn't turn around when she heard his footsteps. She was stirring something in a pot, her left hand holding the handle of the spoon, her right hand gripping the rim of the pot. Both of her hands were deformed, the fingers curled inward, the knuckles swollen large, moving slowly and stiffly, as if every motion had to negotiate with pain before it was allowed to happen. Grant stood in the kitchen doorway, not yet able to say anything, when Grandma Bertie spoke, her voice calm, without lifting her head. "I knew you'd come. Sooner or later, you'd come, but I don't owe you any story, Mr. Holloway." Grant didn't answer. He looked around the kitchen, saw an empty wooden chair beside the dining table, pulled it out, and sat down. Grandma Bertie didn't invite him, didn't look at him. She kept cooking, then washing dishes, then wiping the stovetop, then cooking again. Grant sat still. 2 hours. She cooked, washed, wiped. Grant sat. No one spoke. Jolene wasn't home. She had gone out to deliver repaired clothes to customers, and perhaps Grandma Bertie knew that when she chose not to throw Grant out, but also chose not to speak to him. She was waiting. Not waiting for Jolene to come home. She was waiting for herself to be ready. 2 hours later, Grandma Bertie turned off the stove. She wiped her hands on the cloth towel hanging beside the cabinet, slowly, one finger at a time, then pulled out the chair across from Grant and sat down. She looked at him for the first time since he had stepped inside. Her eyes weren't angry, weren't afraid, weren't sad. They were the eyes of someone who had thought about this conversation many times, who had told this story to herself in her own mind through 100 nights, and now only needed to say it aloud. She told it. Her voice was even, slow, unbroken. 5 months earlier, one afternoon, someone had knocked on the door. She opened it and saw an older man in a suit, holding an oak cane, alone, with no one beside him. He introduced himself as Desmond Holloway. She knew that family name. Everyone in this area knew it. He came into the house, sat in the exact chair Grant was sitting in now, drank a glass of water, and then began to talk. He spoke politely, his voice soft, never raised, never threatening. He said her granddaughter was carrying a child who, if born and known, would destroy an important financial alliance of the Holloway family. He said he didn't want anyone hurt. He only wanted to make an offer. This house would be transferred into Grandma Bertie's name. Monthly living money would be brought directly to her, and in exchange, Jolene would disappear from Grant Holloway's life. Disappear completely. On paper, she would no longer exist. Grandma Bertie said she had meant to refuse. She had opened her mouth to say no. But Desmond didn't let her speak. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out a photograph, and placed it on the table, right in the middle, turning it so she could see it. It was a photograph of a man, about 40 years old, standing in front of some store, looking to one side, unaware that he was being photographed. Desmond didn't explain the picture. He only said, his voice still soft, still polite, "This man once caused trouble for my family. Now no one knows where he is." Then he went quiet. He said nothing more. He didn't need to say more. Grandma Bertie looked at the photograph, then looked down at her own hands resting on the table. The curled fingers, the swollen knuckles, the hands that had once carried her granddaughter, once cooked meals, once mended clothes, and now could no longer hold a spoon tightly. She lifted her eyes to Desmond and said, "Look at these hands, Mr. Holloway. These aren't the hands of someone who can protect her granddaughter from your family anymore." Then she accepted. No bargaining, no crying, no asking for anything more. She signed the papers Desmond had prepared before he ever arrived, which meant he had known her answer before she said it. Grandma Bertie finished telling the story and sat in silence. She didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't explain anything more. She had told it, and that was all she intended to give. Grant sat across from her, silent for a very long time. Then he said, his voice neither high nor low, "I didn't come here for you to ask forgiveness." Grandma Bertie looked at him and tilted her head slightly. "Then what did you come here for?" Grant opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer. He didn't know what he had come here for. To find Jolene? To hear the truth? To make things right? He didn't know. And for the first time in a very long time, Grant Holloway sat before a 78-year-old woman whose hands could no longer hold a glass of water, and he couldn't find a single thing to say. He, a man who had never run out of words before anyone, in any room, had lost today to one question from a woman who had nothing in her hands but the truth. Grant left Grandma Bertie's house without saying goodbye. He stepped out the door, walked straight toward the car, opened it, and got in. Perry looked through the rearview mirror but didn't ask. Grant said 2 words. "Go home." All the way back, he didn't say another word. He sat in the back seat, his eyes looking out the window but seeing nothing, his right hand slowly turning the silver ring. In his mind, Grandma Bertie's question still lay there, whole and unanswered. "Then what did you come here for?" But beside that question, something else was growing. Not an answer. Anger. And now that anger had a name. Perry stopped the car in front of the Holloway mansion. Grant got out, walked straight through the foyer, went up the stairs, turned left, and pushed open the study door. Desmond was sitting there. He was seated in the leather armchair on the left side of the desk, the place where he always sat every evening when he read financial reports. The oak cane rested against the side of the chair. The gold family crest ring on his left ring finger gleamed under the desk lamp. A glass of liquor had already been poured on the small table beside the chair, 1/3 of it gone. He was reading a stack of papers, leisurely, as though nothing unusual was happening anywhere in the world. Grant closed the door behind him. He didn't lock it. He stood in the middle of the room, looked at his uncle, and said, "She's alive." Desmond didn't look up right away. He finished reading the line he was on, set the papers down on the table, and only then looked at Grant. His eyes were calm, with not a trace of surprise, not a single blink from a man caught in the act. He said 1 word, "Yes." Then he lifted the glass, took a sip, and set it down. 1 word. No explanation, no apology, no denial. "Yes." as if Grant had just asked whether the sun was out today. Grant stood still and looked at his uncle. 33 years. 33 years he had looked at this face, listened to this voice, learned everything from these hands. After his father died, Desmond was the one who taught him how to read contracts, taught him how to remain calm in front of an opponent, taught him never to make a decision while angry. And now, every one of those lessons was being used to face the very man who had taught them. Desmond set his glass down, sat a little straighter, and began to speak. His voice was even, cold, neither high nor low, the voice of a man presenting a financial report, not explaining why he had erased a human being. He said the alliance with the Langford family was the financial backbone of the Holloway organization. He said the engagement between Grant and Monica was the legacy Grant's father had laid the foundation for before he died. He said that a pregnant seamstress, if that news came out, would destroy the relationship with the Langfords, which would bring down the line of credit, which would bring down the entire system that 3 generations of Holloways had. "Who gave you permission to decide who lives and who dies in my family?" Grant cut him off. His voice wasn't loud. He didn't shout. But that sentence cut through Desmond's words like a blade cutting through a cord, and everything Desmond had been saying fell to the floor into silence. Desmond stopped. His mouth was still slightly open, the next word still resting on his tongue but unable to come out. This was the first time in Grant's life that he had ever interrupted his uncle. Grant took one step forward. "You taught me to read every line of a contract. You taught me not to sign anything before 48 hours had passed. You taught me never to raise a hand against a subordinate, because raising a hand means losing control. You taught me all of that." He stopped, looked straight into Desmond's eyes. "But you forgot to teach me one thing. You forgot to teach me that you were willing to erase a 27-year-old girl to protect a line of credit. You forgot to teach me that in your eyes, a human being could become one line on a spreadsheet, deleted to make the balance work, and then you could go drink liquor." Desmond looked at Grant. His eyes didn't waver, didn't turn away. He had lived long enough in this world not to fear any stare, not even the stare of the nephew he had raised. He said, his voice still steady, "Your father wouldn't have done differently. If he were alive, he would be sitting exactly where I am sitting now, and making exactly the decision I made." Grant answered at once, leaving no space between Desmond's sentence and his own. "My father isn't here, but I am, and I'm not you." The room went silent. The 2 men looked at each other. Desmond in the armchair, Grant standing in the middle of the room. One man had held power in this organization for more than 20 years. The other was taking that power back by standing straight and looking into the other man's eyes without blinking. Grant spoke, his voice low, each word clear. "From now on, every decision in this organization goes through me, not through you. I'm not throwing you out, but you no longer have the authority to sign, to command, or to decide anything in the name of the Holloway family. Do you hear me clearly?" Desmond was silent. Then he did something Grant had seen thousands of times in his life, but had never understood correctly. He smiled, a faint smile, lifting only one corner of his mouth, his eyes narrowing slightly. For 33 years, every time Grant saw that smile, he had read it as affection, as his uncle being proud of him, as love in the language of men who never said it aloud. But today, under the yellow light in this study, seeing that smile again after knowing everything that smile had once concealed, Grant read something else. It wasn't a smile of affection. It was the smile of a man who had already written every answer before the question was ever asked. And when the question came, he smiled because everything was unfolding exactly as he had foreseen. Even this moment, even being stripped of power, Desmond had known this day would come, and he smiled because he had prepared for it. Grant looked at that smile and understood that this war didn't end here. It had only just begun. Grant found Monica the following afternoon. He needed one night to arrange what he would say. But by morning he realized there was no way to arrange it. There was no way to tell a woman that a wedding 3 weeks away wouldn't happen, and make the sentence sound gentle. So he decided to say it plainly. That was the only thing he could still give her. He found Monica in the back garden of the mansion. She was sitting on a stone bench beneath the old oak tree, alone, not reading a book, not holding her phone, not doing anything. Her hands rested on her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead toward the bougainvillea hedge at the end of the garden. She was waiting. Grant knew she was waiting because she was sitting in the exact place where he would find her first, and because she wasn't surprised at all when she heard his footsteps on the gravel. Maybe she had been waiting since the afternoon before, from the moment he told her to go home first on Broughton Street. Maybe she had been waiting much longer than that. Grant sat down at the other end of the stone bench. Between them was enough empty space for one more person to sit. He didn't touch her, didn't look over. He looked straight ahead, toward the bougainvillea hedge, and spoke. He said there was a woman. She had once worked in the Holloway family sewing workshop. 5 months ago, he had been told she had died. But she hadn't died. She was alive, and she was carrying his child. After he finished speaking, he went silent. He didn't explain further, didn't apologize, didn't say I didn't know or I only just found out, or any other sentence meant to soften the blow he had just delivered. He had thought about those sentences all night, and he had thrown them all away, because each one sounded like an excuse, and Monica Langford didn't deserve excuses. She deserved the truth. Monica said nothing. 1 minute, 2 minutes. She sat still, both hands still resting on her lap, her eyes still looking straight ahead. She didn't turn to look at Grant. She didn't cry. She didn't ask, "Who is she?" or "Since when?" or "Do you love her?" Those were questions for women who had been caught by surprise. Monica hadn't been surprised. She had known. Maybe she hadn't known the details, hadn't known the name, hadn't known about the seamstress or the fake death certificate, but she knew there was something buried at the bottom of this relationship, something everyone around her knew but no one said, and she had chosen not to ask. Monica stood. She stood slowly, without rushing, as though she had known she would stand from the moment she sat down. She walked toward the back door leading into the house, her steps even on the gravel path. At the door, she stopped. Her hand closed around the doorknob, but she didn't open it yet. She stood there with her back turned to Grant and spoke. "I knew from the day my mother wrote to me. She wrote, 'Don't ask my daughter. If there's anything, the people older than you have already handled it.' I read that letter twice. Then I burned it in the sink. Then I put on a dress, went to dinner with you, and smiled." She paused for 1 beat. Her back was still turned. Her voice didn't shake, but her breathing changed, slowing slightly, like someone holding something very heavy in her chest and having to control each breath so it wouldn't fall out. "I chose not to ask. Not because I was a coward, because I thought if I was perfect enough, you would forget her. If I was beautiful enough, smart enough, skilled enough at appearing beside you, you would never need to look anywhere else. That wasn't cowardice, Holloway. That was arrogance. And arrogance hurts far more than cowardice. Because with cowardice, you still know where you went wrong. With arrogance, you trick yourself into believing you're right, until everything collapses." She opened the door, stepped inside, closed it behind her, gently. She didn't slam it, didn't turn back to look. The soft sound of the door closing was like someone setting a book down on a table after finishing the final page. Grant remained on the stone bench, alone, looking at the closed door. He didn't get up and follow her. He didn't call her name, because she didn't need him to chase after her, and he knew that. 1 week later, Grant received a small package delivered to the mansion. A white paper box, no sender's name, no letter, not a single written line inside. Only the engagement ring resting on a piece of black lining cloth. He picked up the ring, held it in his palm for a while, then placed it in a drawer. Not the locked drawer, an ordinary drawer, because this ring didn't need a lock. It was over. The news that Monica had called off the engagement hadn't even had time to spread before Sterling Langford arrived. He came on the morning of the 3rd day after that afternoon in the back garden, without warning, without calling, driving his black Bentley straight into the courtyard of the Holloway mansion, as if he were still a welcomed partner. He brought a lawyer with him. The 2 men stepped into the living room. Sterling sat down without waiting to be invited, while the lawyer stood behind him, holding a thick case file. Grant had known he would come. He was sitting at the desk inside, listening to the sound of tires over gravel, listening to the door, listening to leather shoes crossing the wooden floor, and only then did he stand and walk out. He entered the living room, didn't shake hands, didn't offer tea, only sat down in the chair across from Sterling and looked at him. Sterling Langford was a man unaccustomed to being refused. He had built his real estate empire by never accepting the answer, no, and today he had come here with that same principle. He spoke directly, his voice cold. Each word set exactly in place like a brick in a wall. A unilaterally cancelled engagement was a breach of agreement. The Langford family would withdraw all joint venture capital from Holloway, freeze every contract currently underway, and file a lawsuit for damages. The lawyer opened the case file, took out a stack of papers, and placed it on the table in front of Grant. "This is the number," Sterling said, "and this is only the first step." Grant didn't look at the papers. He looked at Sterling, silent. Then he stood, went to the desk inside, opened a drawer, and took out another file. This one was thinner, gray-covered, unlabeled. He brought it out, placed it on the table right beside the lawyer's papers, and sat down. "Mr. Langford," Grant said, his voice normal, neither high nor low. "This is a record of every dirty transaction you have moved through the Holloway family system over the past 5 years. Every amount, every day, every account. I have the originals, and I have 3 copies in 3 different places." Sterling looked at the gray file. His face didn't change much, but his right hand, the hand resting on the arm of the chair, tightened. Grant continued, "We part cleanly, or we don't part cleanly. But either way, I'm not marrying your daughter. You withdraw your capital, I won't stop you. You sue, I won't block you. But if you choose the ugly way, this file will go somewhere you don't want it to go. And if you choose the clean way, this file will stay exactly where it is, and we never mention this again." The room went silent. The lawyer looked at Sterling. Sterling didn't look at the lawyer. He looked at the gray file, then at Grant, then back at the gray file. He didn't open it to check. He didn't need to open it. He knew what was inside, because he knew what he had done. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and said to the lawyer, "Let's go." The 2 men left the living room, went out the door, and got into the car. The black Bentley rolled out of the mansion courtyard and never came back. That evening, Grant drove alone through downtown Savannah. He had no business there. He just drove. When the car passed Broughton Street, he slowed down. The children's shop on the corner was closed, its lights off, the dark glass reflecting the streetlights. He looked at the glass for 1 second. Then he accelerated and kept going. But while Grant was dealing with Sterling Langford in the living room, Desmond had already begun making his move. He didn't sit still after being stripped of power. He wasn't the kind of man who sat still. In the 2 weeks after the confrontation in the study, Desmond made phone calls. He called every business partner, every credit provider, every important link in the system, whose relationships he had spent more than 20 years cultivating. He didn't speak ill of Grant. He didn't need to speak ill. He only told the truth, but he told it the right way. "My nephew is going through a personal matter. A seamstress. He called off the engagement with the Langfords because of her. I'm concerned he isn't focused on the business." Every call was brief. Every call was polite. Every call ended with a worried sigh. And every call left the same thing in the listener's mind: doubt. 2 weeks. The revenue of the Holloway organization dropped visibly. 2 major partners temporarily suspended transactions to wait until the situation stabilized. 1 credit line stalled. The system Grant had just taken control of was cracking beneath his feet. Not because anyone was attacking from the outside, but because the man stripped of power was breaking it from within, using the very network of relationships he had built. Then the final piece of news came. Trent called Grant at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. "Mr. Desmond has just called a meeting. Tonight. 8 people. All key subordinates. The location is the old warehouse in the East District. 8 people. 8 names Grant knew well. 8 people Desmond had bonded with, helped, lent money to, and cleared debts for over 20 years. 8 people who, if forced to choose between Grant and Desmond, might not choose Grant." Grant set his coffee cup down on the table. He stood, took his jacket from the back of the chair, put it on, and buttoned it. He walked to the door, looked at Perry standing in the hallway, and said, "Get the car. I'm going to the meeting." Perry drove to the warehouse in East Savannah at 7:45. By day, this district was filled with seafood packing workshops. By night, it was as silent as a cemetery. Perry parked the car a short distance from the warehouse gate and looked through the rearview mirror. Grant sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the iron warehouse door that had been left slightly open, with yellow light spilling out from inside. 4 cars were already parked there, Grant counted. 4 cars, 8 men, plus Desmond made 9. Everyone had gone in. Perry asked, opening his mouth for the first time that day, "Do I go in with you?" Grant said, "No, wait here." Perry didn't ask anything else. Grant opened the car door, stepped out, buttoned his coat, and walked straight toward the warehouse door. Alone. No bodyguards. No weapon. Nothing with him except the things already inside his head. He pushed open the iron door and stepped in. Inside was a temporary meeting room, a long table, iron chairs, industrial lights hanging from the ceiling and casting a cold white glow. Desmond sat at the inner head of the table, his oak cane leaning against the side of the chair, the gold family crest ring still on the ring finger of his left hand. 8 men sat around the table. 4 on the left, 4 on the right. Grant knew every face, knew every name, knew what each man had done for the Holloway organization, what each man had received from Desmond, and what each man was hiding in the books. When Grant stepped in, the whole room turned to look. No one stood to greet him. No one invited him to sit. There was an empty chair at the far end of the table. Opposite Desmond, the chair for the man who arrived late, the lower chair. Grant looked at that chair. He didn't sit. He stood. He stood in the middle of the room, one step from the table, both hands at his sides, and looked at each man one by one, slowly, from left to right. His eyes stopped on every face just long enough for that man to know Grant was looking directly at him, not at anyone else. Then Grant began to speak. He looked at the first man on the left and called his name. Barrett. Barrett lifted his head. Grant said, his voice ordinary, as if he were reading a dish off a menu. In March of last year, you moved a sum out of the Northern District operating account into a personal account at Regions Bank, $42,000. You recorded it in the books as transportation expenses. There was no transportation run in March. Barrett went pale. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Grant had already looked at the next man. Pruitt, the second man on the right. You have a private arrangement with the delivery crew at the port, taking a percentage from every shipment you didn't report to the system. That arrangement ran for 14 months. I knew from the second month. Pruitt swallowed. The sound of it was clear in the silent room. Then the third man. Grant called a name, spoke a secret. The fourth. Name. Secret. The fifth. The sixth. The seventh. Grant's voice didn't change from beginning to end. Didn't rise. Didn't fall. Didn't sharpen. Didn't threaten. He spoke like a man reading an inventory list. And that ordinary voice was the most frightening thing in the room, because it made the 8 men sitting around the table understand that Grant wasn't angry, wasn't impulsive, wasn't taking revenge. He was showing them that he knew, that he had always known, and that he had chosen not to speak until today. The 8th man. Grant finished the last secret, then went silent. The whole room went silent. The 8 men sat on their iron chairs as if they had been nailed there. No one looked at Desmond. No one looked at one another. All of them looked down at the table, or at their own hands, or into empty space. Grant said, still standing, "My uncle taught me one thing I will never forget. Know everything, but don't say everything. Today, I have said everything." He paused, looked around the table once. "Next time, I won't speak." Then he stepped forward. He walked along the side of the table, past each chair, straight toward the head of the table, where Desmond sat. He stopped beside Desmond's chair, said nothing, only stood there. Desmond remained still. He looked up at his nephew. His eyes weren't angry, weren't afraid, weren't sad. They were the eyes of a man who had played his final game and knew he had lost. He placed both hands on the arms of the chair. Slowly, he pushed the chair back. The sound of iron chair legs scraping across the concrete floor rasped softly, the only sound in the room. He stood, his back straight. He reached for his oak cane and set it against the floor. Then he stepped aside, one step, enough to give up the seat. He didn't look at Grant. He looked straight ahead, over the heads of the 8 men sitting at the table, toward the iron door in the distance, as if he were looking through a doorway he knew he was about to walk through and never return from. Grant pulled out the chair, sat down, at the head of the table, the place where only one man had sat for the past 20 years. He placed both hands on the tabletop, both palms facing down. The fingers of his right hand turned the silver ring once, then stopped. He didn't need to turn it again. Everything was now in its proper place. The 8 men around the table looked up. They weren't looking at Desmond anymore. They were looking at Grant, and in their eyes, Grant saw exactly what he needed to see. Not affection, not loyalty, but recognition. They recognized that the man sitting at the head of the table now knew everything about them, and that man was giving them one chance to keep sitting in the remaining chairs. That wasn't loyalty. That was reality. And in this world, reality was far more trustworthy than loyalty. Power changed hands inside a warehouse in East Savannah on a Thursday night, without a single gunshot, without anyone falling, without any mark left on the floor. There was only the sound of chair legs scraping over concrete, and an old man with an oak cane walking out through the iron door, his back straight, his head not lowered, stepping into the darkness outside without looking back. Desmond walked out of the warehouse that night, but he didn't leave Savannah. He went back to his private apartment downtown, sat in the darkness, drank, and thought. He had lost operational control, lost the 8 men at the meeting table, lost the seat at the head of the table. But Desmond Holloway wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat without leaving a mark. He had built this organization with 20 years of patience, and if he could no longer keep it, then at the very least, he would make Grant understand that every decision carried a price, and that price wouldn't fall on Grant's head. It would fall on the person Grant was trying to protect. 2 days after the night at the warehouse, on a Saturday evening, 2 men stopped their car in front of the small house, with the blue door on the western edge of suburban Savannah. They didn't knock. They pushed the door open and walked straight in. Jolene was alone. Grandma Birdie had gone to a community clinic in the outer district that afternoon and hadn't come back yet. Jolene was sitting at the sewing machine, repairing a customer's shirt, when she heard the door burst open and the sound of heavy shoes on the wooden floor. She looked up. 2 men stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The way they stood, the way they looked, the way they filled the entire doorframe, had already said everything. Jolene stood up, slowly, because her rounded belly didn't allow her to stand quickly. She placed one hand on the edge of the sewing table to steady herself, then straightened. She looked at the 2 men, then looked toward the inner bedroom door, the room where Grandma Birdie usually slept, the room Jolene knew for certain her grandmother wasn't in, but still stepped in front of as if the old woman were lying inside. She took 1 step back, blocking the bedroom door, her back against the wooden frame, both hands hanging at her sides. She said, her voice not shaking, "My grandmother is sleeping in there. Whatever you want to do it out here." The 2 men looked at each other. One of them looked back at Jolene, looked at her belly, looked at the gray-blue eyes staring straight into his without blinking, then stepped aside and walked around her. He didn't touch her. The other did the same. They moved around Jolene as if walking around a post, and then they began. They overturned the furniture in the outer room. The table was shoved over. Chairs were thrown. The old sewing machine was pushed off the table and fell to the floor with a heavy crash. They tore apart everything within reach. Unfinished clothes, leftover fabric, towels, curtains. They dumped drawers onto the floor, swept things off shelves, kicked boxes over. Not a word was spoken. Everything happened in silence, with only the sound of things breaking, fabric ripping, wood striking the floor. Jolene stood in the doorway of the inner room, her back straight, unmoving, not screaming, not crying, not begging. She watched everything she owned being destroyed in front of her eyes and didn't say a single word. Then they left, as quickly as they had come. They walked out the door, got into the car, and drove away. Jolene remained standing for a while after the sound of the car had completely disappeared. Then she sat down on the floor, slowly, little by little. Her back leaned against the frame of the inner room door, both hands wrapped around her belly. She breathed, in and out, steady, slow, as if she were teaching herself how to breathe all over again. And then, when no one was watching anymore, her hands began to tremble. Both hands trembled, the shaking spreading from her fingers into her wrists, from her wrists up her arms. She gripped the fabric of her dress over her belly, gripping it until her fingers went white, but her hands still shook. She didn't cry. She only trembled, and she trembled until Grandma Birdie came home, opened the door, saw the house in ruins, and her granddaughter sitting on the floor among the wreckage. The old woman didn't ask. She sat down beside Jolene, placed her arthritic hand on her granddaughter's shoulder, and the 2 of them sat in silence in the darkness until the trembling stopped. The next morning, Perry came to Jolene's house to deliver supplies as usual. He saw that the door had been knocked crooked, the upper hinge bent. He stepped inside and saw the furniture scattered everywhere, the sewing machine lying on the floor, fabric spread all over the room. Jolene was kneeling beside the bed, cleaning up. Grandma Birdie sat in a chair, picking up each torn piece of fabric. Perry looked around once, didn't ask, set the bag of supplies on the table, then drove straight to the mansion. He found Grant in the study. He stood in front of the desk and said one sentence. Mr. Desmond's men went to her house last night. Grant didn't ask anything more. He stood, took his coat, and went to the car. He didn't go to Jolene's house. Not yet. He went to a bar in the Eastern Industrial District. The kind of bar that opened in the morning. The kind of place people went when they didn't want to be questioned. The two men from the night before were sitting at a table in the corner. Grant knew they were here because he knew everything in this system. Even the things Desmond thought he didn't know. Grant walked in, went straight to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat across from the two men. They recognized him immediately. Both of their faces hardened. Grant didn't greet them. He took out his phone, opened the screen, and placed it on the table, turned toward them. On the screen were photographs, pictures of houses, cars, the road leading into a home, the school gate where their children went to school. One photograph for each man. Clear, detailed, taken up close. The two men looked at the photographs, looked up at Grant, looked back at the photographs. Their faces slowly went pale, Grant said, his voice ordinary, gentle, as if he were asking someone to bring him another cup of coffee. She's waiting for the day she gives birth. You just tore apart the home of a girl who's about to become a mother. After he said it, he stood. He picked up his phone, put it in his pocket, and walked out of the bar. No threat, no conditions, no need. The photographs had said everything for him. And that final sentence, that phrase, a girl who's about to become a mother, wasn't an accusation. It was a reminder that they had just done something that even in their world, no one did. And the man who had just sat across from them was the one who controlled that world. Before noon that day, both men had left Savannah. They didn't inform Desmond, didn't call anyone. They simply drove away and didn't come back. Desmond lost two more men. But more importantly, he had just lost the last thing he could use to reach Jolene. And Grant, for the first time since seeing her through the glass of the children's shop, allowed himself to think about going to see her. Not because he was ready, but because now, he had made sure that the road to her house no longer had anyone waiting in the middle. Grant went to Jolene's house that afternoon. Perry parked the car some distance from the house as he always did, turned off the engine, and sat waiting. Grant walked to the front door. The door was slightly open, the upper hinge still bent from the night before, not yet repaired by anyone. He pushed the door and stepped inside. The house was exactly as Perry had described. The table leaned on one leg. Chairs were overturned. The sewing machine lay on the floor, its pedal broken off, its drive belt snapped. Fabric was scattered across the floor. White, gray, tiny floral prints, mixed with customers' unfinished clothes, kitchen towels, and curtains that had been torn down. Cabinet drawers had been pulled out and dumped upside down, their contents spilled everywhere. And in the middle of the floor beside the bed, Jolene was kneeling. She was on both knees, her back slightly bent because her rounded belly wouldn't let her lean straight down. Her hands were picking up each small piece of fabric from the floor, pieces of ivory white cotton that Grant recognized at once, even though he had never seen them before. They were pieces cut for newborn shirts, carefully shaped, half sewn, with white thread still clinging to the edges. The little shirts Jolene had made by hand from customers' leftover fabric, one stitch at a time, on nights after Grandma Bertie had gone to sleep. Now they were scattered across the floor, some torn, some stained, some still whole but crushed and wrinkled. Jolene heard Grant's footsteps but didn't lift her head. She knew who was standing at the door. She knew because Perry had come that morning. And if Perry knew, Grant would know. And if Grant knew, he would come. But she didn't lift her head. She kept picking up fabric. Grant stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her kneel on the floor among the wreckage. He said nothing. He didn't ask, "Are you all right?" He didn't ask, "Who did this?" He didn't say, "I'll handle it." He had already handled it that morning, at the bar in the industrial district. But he didn't tell Jolene that because she didn't need to hear it. She needed something else, something he had never given anyone in his life, something he wasn't even sure he knew how to give, a presence that didn't come with an order. Grant bent down. He picked up a small piece of fabric near his foot, a piece of ivory white cotton no larger than his palm, its edge torn along one line, though the seam was still intact. He folded the fabric carefully, folded it in half, then folded it in half again, and placed it on the table that had been set upright again. Then he knelt on the floor beside Jolene and began to pick things up. He picked things up, and she picked things up. He lifted chairs and set them upright. She gathered fabric and stacked it on the table. He picked up a drawer and slid it back into the cabinet. She swept broken pieces from the floor. No one spoke. 2 hours. The only sounds in the kitchen were the broom moving over the floor, the drawer sliding into place, fabric being folded again, and breathing. Grandma Bertie sat in the wooden chair in the corner of the kitchen, watching the two of them clean, her hands resting on her lap, saying nothing. She looked at Grant Holloway, the man to whom she had told the worst story of her life the day before, now kneeling on her granddaughter's floor beside the bed, picking up little pieces of cloth meant for baby clothes, and she didn't know what to think of it. When the kitchen was almost put back together, when the table and chairs were standing where they belonged, when the fabric had been stacked into piles on the table, when the floor was clean, Grant stopped. He stood beside the table, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and took out an envelope. The envelope was thick and heavy. He placed it on the table, right in the middle, directly in front of Jolene, then withdrew his hand. He didn't say what it was. He didn't need to. Jolene looked down at the envelope and knew. She looked at the envelope. Then she looked up at Grant. Those gray-blue eyes, the eyes he had seen through the glass of the children's shop, were looking at him with a gaze he couldn't read. Not anger, not gratitude, not contempt. Something deeper than all of those things. Something it would take him many more days to begin to understand. Jolene placed her hand on the envelope and pushed it back toward Grant. Gently, but firmly, she said, her voice calm, neither high nor low, not shaking. Your uncle also put money on this table, 5 months ago, the same table. 1 sentence. 14 words. And those 14 words were heavier than anything Grant had heard in all the days before. Heavier than Grandma Bertie's testimony, heavier than Desmond's word yes, heavier than the complicit glance between Keene and Shaw, because those 14 words didn't accuse anyone. They simply told Grant something so plain it was brutal. He and his uncle had just placed the same thing on the same table in front of the same woman. Money. As if money were the answer to everything. As if she were something that could be bought. Grant looked at the envelope on the table. Then he looked at Jolene. He understood. Not with his head, but with something deeper. Somewhere men like him rarely reached. He picked up the envelope, put it back into the inside pocket of his jacket, and walked to the door. Without a word, without an apology, without a promise, because any words at that moment would have been like money, something he offered so he could feel he had done something, while what Jolene needed wasn't something he could give. What she needed, he had to do, and he didn't yet know what to do. He stepped outside, got into the car, and Perry drove away. All the way back, Grant didn't speak, but in his head, those 14 words kept circling, over and over, and every time they passed through, they clawed at some layer he had built around himself for 33 years, the shell of a man who believed everything had a price, and every problem could be solved with enough money. Jolene had just shown him that there were things money couldn't buy, and the worst part was that he had known that for a long time, but no one had ever looked him in the eye and said it so plainly. The next day, Grant woke at 5 o'clock in the morning. He sat at the desk in the mansion, signed 3 transportation contracts, approved the week's financial report, and made 2 phone calls to partners in Atlanta, his voice cold, brief, and precise. By 10 o'clock, he was meeting with Trent about restructuring the Northern District after Barrett's departure. By noon, he ate alone in his room, read documents, and signed 2 more papers. By day, Grant Holloway was still the Grant Holloway the organization needed. Cold, controlled, without a single opening. That afternoon, he drove to Jolene's house. Perry parked the car 200 meters away, turned off the engine, and waited. Grant stepped out, opened the trunk, took out 2 bags of groceries, and walked to the front door. The door was closed. He placed the 2 bags on the front step. Then he returned to the car, got in, and left. He didn't knock. He didn't leave a note. On the second day, he came at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The water pipe in the yard was leaking, water seeping into a small puddle at the base of the wall. He took off his suit jacket, rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, and fixed the pipe. It took 2 hours. Then he left. On the 3rd day, a section of the backyard fence had fallen, the rotten wooden slats broken. He replaced the boards with new ones, hammered in the nails, and set it upright again. Then he left. 3 days, 3 afternoons, Grant Holloway took off his suit jacket in front of a seamstress's house and did things he had never done in his life. All 3 days, the door stayed closed. No one came out. No one said anything. On the 4th day, when Grant arrived, the door was already open. Open just a crack, enough for the light inside to spill out. He pushed it open and stepped in. On the kitchen table were 2 glasses of water. Grandma Birdie sat in the wooden chair beside the stove, looking at him. She didn't stand, didn't greet him. She looked at him for a long time, then said, "Sit down." Grant sat. She went on, her voice slow. "That girl won't talk to you. Not yet. It may be a very long time before she does. She may never. But she left the door open. In my life, 78 years in this world, that is already a great deal." Grant didn't answer. He drank the glass of water, sat a while longer, then went outside to fix the front door hinge, the hinge that had been bent from the night Desmond's 2 men pushed their way in. When he finished fixing it, Jolene still didn't come out, but through the kitchen window, he saw that the second glass of water on the table had been half emptied. On the 5th day, Grant brought a cradle, a wooden cradle, its white paint slightly yellowed, its legs a little curved, with a few small scratches on the surface. The kind of second-hand cradle people sold in a thrift shop. He carried the cradle from the trunk into the backyard, set it down, took out his tools, and began putting it together. The legs needed their screws tightened, the sides needed to be gently smoothed with sandpaper, and one loose rail needed to be nailed back into place. He worked the entire afternoon, alone, in the backyard, under the shade of a small oak tree. Perry sat in the car 200 meters away. Grandma Birdie sat in the kitchen. Jolene stood behind the curtain of the inner room window, looking out. She stood there all afternoon, one hand holding the curtain open by a narrow gap, watching the man kneeling in the backyard and assembling a cradle for the baby he had only learned existed less than 2 weeks ago. She didn't go out, didn't speak, only watched. When Grant finished, he pushed the cradle onto the back porch, under the shelter of the roof, set it neatly in place, wiped away the wood dust, then stood, rolled his sleeves down, put his suit jacket back on, and left. After the sound of his car had faded into the distance, Grandma Birdie went into the inner room to look for Jolene. She was no longer behind the curtain. She was sitting on the back porch, on the floor, beside the cradle. Her hand rested on the wooden rail, her fingers tracing slowly along the grain, lightly, the way people touch something they have wanted for a very long time but have never dared believe they would have. And she was crying. Silently. Tears ran down both sides of her face, fell onto the fabric of her dress, fell onto her rounded belly, fell onto the wooden porch floor. It was the first time she had cried in 5 months. Grandma Birdie stood in the doorway and looked at her granddaughter for a while, then turned back inside without saying anything. There are moments when people need to be allowed to cry alone. That night, Grant came back. He hadn't planned to come back, but something pulled him there, something he couldn't name. He arrived at 9 o'clock at night, walked from where the car was parked to the front of the house, and saw Grandma Birdie sitting on the front porch, alone, in the darkness, holding a rosary. She was talking, her voice small and soft, speaking to someone who wasn't there. Grant stopped at the porch step and listened. She was calling her daughter's name, Jolene's mother, who had been gone for a long time. She spoke to her daughter as if she were sitting beside her, telling her about Jolene, telling her about the baby who would soon be born, telling her about the house. Her voice wasn't sad, wasn't happy. It was the voice of someone reporting the state of things to someone on the other side, someone she believed was still listening. Grant stood still. Then Grandma Birdie stopped speaking and, without turning around, said to him, "I know you're standing there, Mr. Holloway." Grant didn't hide. He sat down on the porch step, a few steps away from her. She continued, her eyes looking into the darkness ahead. "I'm not afraid to die. I've lived enough. I'm afraid of dying before that girl is safe. Do you understand? I hold on to this old body day after day, not because I want to live longer, because Jolene has no one yet." Grant sat in silence for a very long time. Then he said, his voice low and soft, not the voice of command, not the voice of negotiation, a voice even he had never heard himself use before. "Grandma Birdie, I can't promise anything, but I'm sitting here." Grandma Birdie nodded slowly, the rosary still in her hand. "All right, today that is enough." On the 6th night, Grant came as usual. The door was open. 2 glasses of water sat on the table, but this time, Jolene was sitting at the kitchen table. She sat there, waiting for him. She didn't stand when he came in, didn't greet him, only watched as he sat down in the chair across from her. The two of them sat in silence for a while. Then Jolene spoke. She told him, her voice calm, unhurried, not telling it to beg for pity, but telling it so he would know. She told him that when she was taken away from Savannah, she didn't know she was pregnant yet. She only found out a month later, in a small town where she knew no one. She was constantly tired, nauseous, unable to eat. One noon, she was sitting in a roadside diner, trying to eat a bowl of porridge, when a woman at the next table looked at her and said, "Child, you're not tired, you're carrying." Then the woman stood, paid, and left. She didn't say another word, didn't ask her name. A stranger said one sentence and disappeared, and that sentence changed everything. When Jolene finished telling it, she fell silent. She drank water. Grant drank water. Neither of them said anything more. But for the first time since the 3 seconds when they looked at each other through the glass of the children's shop, the two of them sat at the same table, drank the same water, in the same kitchen, and no one walked away. That night, Grant left Jolene's house close to 11 o'clock. He drove alone, because Perry had gone back earlier at his order. The road from the western suburbs back toward downtown Savannah was empty at night, with black oak trees lining both sides, their hanging roots drooping low, the streetlights spaced far apart, and only once in a while did a car pass from the opposite direction. Grant drove more slowly than usual. His mind was on the kitchen table, the 2 glasses of water, and Jolene's voice as she told him about the strange woman in the roadside diner. He was thinking about the sentence, "Child, you're not tired, you're carrying," when the headlights of a car ahead burst on in a blinding white glare. The car was parked across the road, blocking both lanes. Grant slowed down. His first instinct wasn't fear, but reading the situation. A black SUV, lights off and then on, parked across the road. Not an accident because there was no sign of impact. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw another car switch on its lights behind him, moving closer. 2 cars, one blocking the front, one blocking the back. He understood in half a second. Grant hit the gas. He didn't brake, didn't stop, didn't wait to see who was inside the car. He turned the wheel hard to the right and drove up onto the shoulder, the front tires digging through soft dirt and tree roots, the car shaking, tilting, but still moving. He heard a dry, short crack, 2 shots in a row, then the rear windshield shattered. Glass fell into the back seat, and in that same instant, his left shoulder jerked hard, as if someone had punched him with a fist burning hot. He didn't look down. He held the wheel, kept the gas down, drove through the narrow space between the SUV and the trees, the rear tires sliding over dead leaves. Then the car made it back onto the road, and he accelerated. The 2 cars behind him didn't follow. Maybe they hadn't expected him to drive up onto the shoulder instead of stopping. Maybe they had only been paid to scare him, not chase him. Grant didn't know, and didn't care. He drove 2 more kilometers before looking down at his left shoulder. His white shirt had soaked up a dark patch at the shoulder, and the patch was spreading, slowly, steadily, bleeding down into his sleeve. His left shoulder was numb, his arm still able to move but weak. He needed a doctor. He had a private doctor. He had an entire hidden medical system that could bring someone with 1 phone call. But he didn't call. He didn't go back to the mansion. He thought of Jolene. If someone had bought information from Desmond about his address, then they might also know where he went every afternoon. They knew this road. They knew he drove alone at night. And if they knew those things, then they might know the blue-doored house on the edge of the suburbs. Grant turned the wheel, swung the car around, and drove back in the direction he had just come from. He knocked on Jolene's door at 3 o'clock in the morning. His right hand knocked, while his left hand held his shoulder. His shirt no longer white, but dark across the entire left sleeve. He stood on the front step, his back leaning against the doorframe, breathing heavily. Jolene opened the door. She looked at him, looked at his shoulder, looked at his arm, looked at the dark stain on his shirt. She didn't scream, didn't shout, didn't ask, "What happened?" She took his right arm, pulled him inside, and pushed him down onto the kitchen chair. Then she turned away, took clean towels, a bowl of warm water, and pulled the table lamp closer. Grandma Birdie woke because of the noise, came out into the kitchen, saw Grant sitting on the chair with his shoulder soaked through, said nothing, and went to the old medicine cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. She took out a bottle of antiseptic and a roll of gauze she had kept for a very long time. Jolene cut Grant's shirt open at the shoulder with scissors. She looked at the wound, quickly, assessing it, then cleaned it with a warm towel. She didn't say he needed to go to the hospital, because she understood that this man didn't go to hospitals, and she understood that he had come here instead of somewhere else for a reason. She opened the sewing box, took out a needle and thread, sewing thread, not medical thread, but it was the only thing in the house. She threaded the needle, sterilized it with Grandma Birdie's medicine, and began to stitch. Jolene held the needle the same way she held a needle every day, every night, through all those years at the old sewing machine, at the cutting table, on her lap when she sat and sewed by hand. The stitches were straight, even. The distance between each one precise, not shaking, not hesitant. She stitched as if she were sewing the hem of a shirt, calm, focused, her eyes on every pass of the needle instead of on Grant's face. Grant sat still, gritting his teeth, his right hand gripping the edge of the chair, but he didn't make a sound. Grandma Birdie stood beside them, holding the lamp, shining the light so Jolene could see clearly. No one said a word through all of it. There was only the sound of the needle going through, the thread pulling and breathing. Jolene finished stitching, cut the thread, pressed gauze over the wound, and wiped her hands on a towel. She stood and washed her hands at the kitchen sink. Grandma Birdie looked at the two of them a while longer, then turned back into her room and closed the door gently. She knew when to stay and when to leave. The two of them sat in the kitchen. The table lamp was still on. Jolene came back from the sink and sat down in the chair across from Grant. She looked at him and said, her voice calm, "If you're in my life, this won't be the last time." Grant looked at her. "I know." Jolene nodded slightly, as if he had just confirmed something she had known for a long time. Then she went on, more slowly, as if this sentence had been sitting inside her for a very long time, and tonight she had finally decided to let it go. "I've wondered for the past 5 months, every night. If you had known I was alive, would you have come looking for me? Or would you have married Miss Langford and gone on living?" Grant was silent. That question lay between them on the kitchen table. Heavy, quiet, waiting. He could have said, "Yes, I would have come looking." That sentence would have sounded beautiful. That sentence would have been exactly what any woman would want to hear. But he didn't know whether it was true. He didn't know whether, 5 months ago, if he had known Jolene was alive, he would have chosen differently. He didn't know whether he would have had enough courage to break the engagement, face Desmond, face Sterling, face the entire system he stood at the top of. He didn't know, and he chose to tell the truth. "I don't know." Jolene looked at him. For a long time, her gray-blue eyes under the table lamp were not angry, not disappointed, not wounded. They were the eyes of someone who had just heard what she needed to hear, not what she wanted to hear, but what was true. She said, "That is the only right answer you've given me from the beginning until now." Then she stood, took a pillow and a thin blanket, and placed them on the long bench in the kitchen. "You'll sleep here tonight. That shoulder shouldn't be driving." Then she went into the inner room and closed the door. No good night, nothing more. Grant lay down on the long bench, his left shoulder aching, the ceiling low, the kitchen light turned off. He lay in the small kitchen, listening to the insects outside in the yard, listening to Grandma Birdie cough softly in her room, listening to the wind stir the curtain at the window. And he thought that of all the rooms he had ever slept in, this was the smallest, the poorest, and the first place where someone had told him that his truth was enough. The next morning, Grant woke up on the long bench in Jolene's kitchen, his left shoulder stiff, the stitched wound aching but not bleeding. Grandma Birdie was already awake, boiling water. She placed a glass of warm water in front of him and said nothing. Jolene didn't come out. Grant drank the water, stood, folded the blanket, put the pillow back where it belonged, and walked to the door. Before stepping across the threshold, he stopped and looked back into the kitchen. Grandma Birdie stood at the sink, her back turned to him. He said softly, "Thank you." Grandma Birdie didn't turn around, but she nodded. Grant stepped outside, got into the car Perry had already parked and waiting, and drove back to the mansion. When he got home, he didn't rest. He went into the study, closed the door, sat down, and worked. The first thing he did was call Trent and order him to retrieve all of Desmond's communications from the past 2 weeks. Every call, every message, every meeting. The results came in before noon. Grant read them, and he found exactly what he was looking for. Desmond had sold internal information from the Holloway organization to the Eastern Gang. Transportation routes, delivery schedules, warehouse addresses, and most importantly, Grant's personal schedule, including the road he drove every night from the western suburbs. Desmond hadn't hired the men for the ambush. He had sold the information and let someone else do the rest. That was his way. Always. Never his own hands. Always one layer between himself and the consequences. Grant closed the file. He took a large envelope and put 3 things inside. Copies of all the evidence of communication between Desmond and the Eastern Gang, a one-way plane ticket to Miami leaving the next morning, and a small piece of paper. On the paper, he wrote 2 words and 1 number, 24 hours. He sealed the envelope, called Perry in, and placed it on the desk. Take this to Mr. Desmond. Put it directly in his hand. Say nothing. Perry took the envelope, nodded, and walked out. Perry drove to Desmond's apartment in downtown Savannah. He knocked on the door, and Desmond opened it. The 2 men looked at each other. Perry handed him the envelope. Desmond took it. Perry turned and went down the stairs without saying a single word. Desmond closed the door, sat down in his chair, and opened the envelope. He read each page of evidence slowly and carefully, as if reading a contract. Then he looked at the plane ticket. Then he looked at the piece of paper. 24 hours. He placed everything on the table, sat back, and looked out the window. He didn't call anyone. Didn't call a lawyer. Didn't call a partner. Didn't call any of the 8 men at that meeting table that night, because he knew no one would answer. The next morning, exactly 24 hours after Perry delivered the envelope, Desmond Holloway stood at the gate of the family mansion. 2 suitcases were set beside his feet. His oak cane rested against the gravel. The gold family crest ring was still on the ring finger of his left hand. He wore a gray suit, perfectly pressed, polished shoes, his hair neatly combed. He stood there like a man going to a party, not a man leaving behind everything he had built over 20 years. Grant stood in the hallway by the front entrance, 15 steps away from Desmond. Uncle and nephew looked at each other across the gravel courtyard. Neither man stepped forward. Neither man shook hands. The driver Desmond had hired himself was waiting by the car, the engine already running. Desmond looked at Grant for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice even, neither high nor low, the voice he had used for 33 years, while raising the nephew standing across from him. Your father would be at peace, son. Not with me, with you. Grant didn't answer. He heard that sentence, and understood both layers inside it. The first layer, Desmond was admitting that Grant had won, and that his father would be proud. The second layer, his father would be at peace with him, but everything Grant had used to win, the intelligence, the coldness, the ability to read people, the ability to keep secrets, all of it had been taught by Desmond. It was a compliment, and it was a reminder, and Desmond knew Grant was smart enough to hear both. Desmond bent down, picked up the 2 suitcases, and walked to the car. The driver opened the trunk and loaded them in. Desmond opened the rear door and got inside. He didn't look back. The car door closed. The car rolled out of the mansion courtyard, turned right at the end of the road, and disappeared behind the oak trees. Grant stood in the hallway and watched until he could no longer see the car. Then he turned back inside, closed the door, and sat down at his desk. He didn't call anyone. Didn't announce anything to anyone. Desmond was gone, and the world of the Holloway organization would adjust on its own, because it always adjusted on its own. Those who needed to know would know. Those who needed to forget would forget. 2 months later, the Eastern Gang was no longer operating in Savannah. No one asked why. 2 weeks after Desmond left Savannah, on a Tuesday night, Grant was sitting at Jolene's kitchen table drinking water when Jolene suddenly stood halfway up, one hand gripping the edge of the table, her face changing. She didn't say anything, but the way she held the table's edge, the way she closed her eyes and opened them again, the way she breathed, told Grant this wasn't something ordinary. Grandma Bertie was washing dishes at the sink, and when she heard the chair scrape back, she turned around, looked at her granddaughter for 1 second, then set the dish down, dried her hands, and said in the calmest voice Grant had ever heard, 2 weeks early, but that's all right, boil water. Grant stood. He didn't ask, how much, or what kind of water, or what for. He went to the stove, put a pot on, opened the tap, and lit the flame. Grandma Bertie led Jolene into the inner room, helped her lie down on the bed, and tucked pillows behind her back. Then she came back out to the kitchen, took clean towels, and stacked them on a chair. She moved slowly because her hands wouldn't allow her to move any faster, but every step was steady, and every item she took was exactly what needed to be taken. She had helped with dozens of births in her lifetime, back in the days when women in this area gave birth at home, and the midwife was the oldest woman in the neighborhood. She knew what to do, but her hands couldn't do it anymore. She sat down in the chair beside Jolene's bed, and she guided them with words, step by step. Her voice was even, slow, clear, like someone reading a recipe she had memorized by heart. Bring the warm water in and set it beside the bed. Spread a towel under her back. Get 2 more towels, fold them in half, and keep them ready. Grant did it. He followed every word she said, without asking, without hesitating. He boiled water, carried it in, spread towels, changed them when they were wet, brought fresh water, wiped Jolene's forehead, supported her back when she needed to sit up, and helped her lie down again when she needed to lie down. He did things he had never done before, things no one in the Holloway organization could have imagined him doing, with the same hands that, only a few weeks earlier, had signed contracts worth millions of dollars and placed an envelope marked 24 hours on a table. Perry had driven off to find a midwife in the outskirts just after midnight. It was far, and the midwife lived all the way out in the county, so Perry had to drive for more than an hour. While Perry was gone, inside the small house with the blue door, there were only 3 people. Grandma Birdie sitting in a chair and guiding with her voice, Jolene lying on the bed, and Grant kneeling beside the bed, following every word. Time stretched out. Every minute felt like 10 minutes. Jolene didn't scream, didn't shout. She bit her lip, gripped the towel tightly, and breathed to the rhythm Grandma Birdie counted. Grant changed the wet towels, again and again, his hands damp with warm water, sweat running from his forehead to his chin, the rolled sleeves of his shirt soaked through at both arms. He knelt on the floor beside the bed, his eyes on Grandma Birdie, waiting for the next instruction, and she never made him wait long. Her voice was the only thing keeping the room from falling into chaos. She didn't shout, didn't rush, didn't panic. She spoke each sentence like a footstep on a road she had walked many times before. Perry brought the midwife in just in time near the end. The midwife stepped into the room, saw a man with his sleeves rolled up, sweat covering his face, kneeling beside the bed and following the instructions of an old woman sitting in a chair, and she didn't ask anything. She only washed her hands, sat down, and continued the work. The baby girl was born before dawn. Outside the window, the sky was still dark when the first cry rose inside the small house, a short, high cry, breaking through the silence that had lasted for hours, then stopping. The baby lay still on her mother's chest, her eyes closed, her tiny hand clenched, so small she almost didn't seem real. Grandma Birdie stood, took a warm towel, and washed the baby gently with trembling hands that still knew exactly where to touch. Then she placed the baby in Jolene's arms. Jolene lay on the bed, her wet hair stuck to her forehead, her face pale but her eyes open. Those gray-blue eyes bright in the yellow light. She held her child, looked down at the tiny face, then lifted her eyes to Grant. He was kneeling beside the bed, both hands resting on his knees, sweat still not dry on him, his shirt wrinkled, his left shoulder still covered with gauze from the stitches 2 weeks earlier. Jolene said softly, "Come here." Grant moved closer. Jolene lifted the baby, slowly, gently, and placed her in his arms. Grant held her with both hands open, carefully, as if holding something that might break if he breathed too hard. The baby fit completely inside his 2 palms, warm, light, her eyes still closed. Grant looked down. He had held many things in his life: contracts, money, power, even files that could ruin other people's lives. But he had never held anything this light and this heavy at the same time. Jolene watched him holding their child. Then she said, her voice small, just loud enough for the 2 of them to hear, "Those hands have 2 choices from now on. Hold power, or hold your child. You can't hold both." Grant looked down at his hands, the hands holding the baby, and he saw that they were trembling. Not because he was afraid, not because he was cold, but because for the first time in his life, he was holding something he couldn't control, couldn't buy, couldn't command, couldn't threaten, couldn't keep through anything he had learned over 33 years. The only thing that could hold this child was presence, every day, day after day, and he didn't yet know whether he could do it. Outside the window, the sky began to brighten. A thin streak of light in the east, pale orange, slowly spread across the dark sky. Jolene looked out the window, then looked down at the baby. She said, "Dawn." Grant lifted his head. Jolene said it again. Her name. Dawn. Because she was born when the day was just beginning. Grant looked at the baby in his hands. Dawn. Daybreak. He nodded. And for the first time since he stepped into this house with the blue door, since he saw Jolene through the glass of the children's shop, since he read the list of liars, since he stripped Desmond of power, since he sat at the head of the table in the warehouse, since he was shot on the dark road, since he lay on the long bench in the kitchen listening to the insects, for the first time, Grant Holloway didn't think about anything except the tiny life resting in his hands. In the months that followed, everything fell into its proper place. Without noise, without drama, only quietly, the way real consequences always arrive. Grant sent all the evidence about the forged documents Dr. Keene had signed to an independent lawyer outside the Holloway system. The lawyer submitted the file to the medical board. Keene was investigated and lost his license to practice. He closed his clinic, sold his house, and left Savannah on an early morning when no one was there to see him off. Father Shaw was different. No one accused him. No one sent evidence. One morning, he came to the Holloway mansion on his own, stood at the doorway of Grant's study, and said, "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness. I came to tell you that I've written a letter of confession to the bishop. The letter went out this morning." Then he turned and walked away. Grant sat at his desk and watched him go, saying nothing. "There are some things that don't need anything," said. Perry Sims passed away in his sleep 1 year after Dawn was born. He wasn't sick, wasn't in pain, simply slept and didn't wake. Grant chose the headstone himself, wrote the inscription himself, and stood there himself as they lowered it into the ground. On the stone there was only one line, Perry Sims, a man of this house. No other line was needed, because everything Perry had done, everything he had kept silent about, everything he had chosen, was held completely inside those 5 words. Grandma Bertie Tabb passed away 1 year after Perry. One early morning, Jolene woke, went out to the porch, and found her sitting in the wooden chair on the front porch. Her back rested against the chair, her hand held the rosary, her eyes were closed, and her face was turned east, where the first sunlight of the day was pouring through the oak trees. Jolene looked at her. She didn't call her name, didn't shake her. She knew. She pulled a chair beside her, sat down gently, and placed her hand over Bertie's. Those arthritic hands, held one last time, warm in the morning sun. Grant and Jolene never married. Grant asked only once, on an ordinary evening, while Jolene was sitting at the sewing machine stitching a shirt for Dawn. She heard him, stopped the needle, and looked at him. What was lost isn't redeemed with a wedding, Holloway. It's redeemed by showing up every day. Then she went back to sewing. Grant didn't ask a second time. He understood that answer wasn't a refusal. It was a condition. And that condition had no expiration date. 6 years passed. 6 years of mornings when Grant sat at the mansion signing papers, and afternoons when he drove to the house with the blue door. 6 years of dinners at the kitchen table. 2 glasses of water, then 3 glasses when Dawn was old enough to sit at the table. 6 years of showing up every day. On Dawn's first day of school, Grant drove her there himself. He parked in front of the gate, turned off the engine, and looked back at Dawn sitting in the rear seat. 6 years old, brown hair, gray-blue eyes like her mother's, his nose. She hugged her new school bag against her chest, looked out at the school gate, then looked back at her father. Grant got out and opened the rear door for her. Dawn stepped down and stood on the sidewalk. The teacher stood at the gate, greeting the students, looked down at Dawn and smiled, then looked up at Grant. "Is this your father?" the teacher asked gently, the polite question she asked every parent on the first day of school. Dawn turned back and looked at Grant. She looked at her father, the man standing on the sidewalk outside the elementary school gate, in a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the man who 6 years earlier had knelt on a floor beside the bed and received her into the world. The man who had come every day, not just on easy days, but every day. Dawn nodded, looked at the teacher, and said, "Yes, ma'am. He's my father." 2 words, my father. Grant stood at the school gate and watched his daughter follow the teacher, crossing the yard, disappearing behind the classroom door. He stayed there for a while after she had gone inside. The fingers of his right hand turned the plain silver ring on his ring finger, slowly. 1 circle. But this time, for the first time in all the times he had turned that ring, he wasn't holding back pain. He was holding back something else. something it had taken him a very long time to recognize by name. The realization that he had spent half his life building an empire people called by his family name, and he was spending the other half learning how to be worthy of the 2 words a 6-year-old girl had just called him in front of her teacher. Grant returned to the car. He drove himself. The seat beside him was empty. Perry was no longer sitting there. He started the engine, looked once more in the rearview mirror toward the school gate, then let the car roll forward. Alone, but not lonely. Because real power isn't controlling other people. Real power is daring to let go of control in order to do what is right, even when doing what is right makes you look weaker in everyone else's eyes. And family isn't something decided by the same last name or the same blood. Family is a choice. Every day. Not on easy days. Every day. Grant and Jolene's story isn't a story about love saving anyone. It is the story of a man learning how to be present, and a woman strong enough not to need anyone, yet brave enough to open the door. It is the story of an old woman with arthritic hands, who kept her granddaughter alive through the darkness by accepting a bargain she hated. And it is the story of a silent driver who wrote one piece of paper and changed everything. If this story touched you, please hit like to support us. Share this video with the people you think need to hear this story, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment and let us know. We always want to hear the feelings that come from deep inside your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.